All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Anslone Show. And we have a big one lined up for today. Of course, returning to the show is our most frequent guest, Dave DeCamp, news editor of Antiwar.com. Dave, how you doing today?
Good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, Dave, I have a lot I want to talk to you about today. There's so much going on. Of course, we knew Trump's foreign policy was going to be far more dynamic than Joe Biden's, but the pace at which the news moves and we get these wild and at times conflicting statements from the administration means there's always a lot to talk about and break down. So, of course, I want to start off with Gaza and will Trump help with the genocide there? Then talk about Iran's red lines and how nuclear talks are going, and then, of course, Trump talking to Putin and Zelensky today. So I want to get the latest from you on that. And this is a scoop from you at antiwar.com. The Pentagon having casualty figures. So, Dave, let's just get right into this. The first article we have up here today is one I wrote over the weekend for antiwar.com. Rubio tells Netanyahu Trump is concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And then you have an article out on Sunday. Netanyahu announces Israel will allow basic amount of food aid into Gaza. And of course, the big question here is, Dave, did the Trump administration put a significant amount of pressure on Netanyahu? And are the Palestinians finally going to be able to eat again?
Yeah, well, that is the big question. And then today, the news was that both Netanyahu and Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, came out and they said, "Listen, because they're essentially responding to their critics in the government that are to the right." And saying, listen, this is what we got to do. We have to let in a minimal amount of aid into Gaza to ensure that we still receive support from the U.S. Netanyahu's statement said something like, it's just essentially what we have to do to make sure that we keep getting support for our plan to take over Gaza. Smotrich said the plan is still to destroy Gaza. And so since Netanyahu made that announcement on Sunday, according to Israel, they've only allowed 5 trucks to enter Gaza, some carrying baby food and other types of aid. And, everything has been blocked since March 2nd. So 5 trucks, I mean, that is really nothing. And, the question is there going to be sufficient relief for the Palestinians? And based on what we're seeing, from Israeli officials saying they're going to let, dozens of aid trucks in, that's just not going to cut it to really stave off a famine, a real crisis here. And, this is them letting these few aid trucks in is coupled with Israel really ramping up its military operations, launching this next phase. And so, the minuscule amount of aid, I don't think is going to bring real relief. But the other question is the U.S. really putting pressure on Netanyahu to end this thing? There's been negotiations happening. There's been some reports, some indications. There's just this source quoted in the Washington Post said that Trump's message has been, we're going to abandon you if you don't end this war. Which it's hard to believe that that's actually really what they say. I think it's more like Trump is showing he's going to go his own way in the region, and do these deals with the Saudis and even the ceasefire with the Houthis. But I still haven't seen any indication here that he's really threatening to cut off the military aid or what it would really take to get Israel to stop the slaughter in Gaza.
And I really have questions, Dave, on if Trump has the bureaucratic ability to actually stop the U.S. military aid to Israel, even though the president kind of gets to do what he wants now on certain issues. Congress still does get to weigh in. And I have to imagine if he were to try to end aid to Israel, you would have most of the Democrats, most of the Republicans in the House and Senate say that, no, you do not. The president doesn't get to decide this. We approved 23 whatever it is $billion of military aid for Israel, and they are going to get every penny. We've heard this kind of referred to in the war in Ukraine as well, and what they want the Ukrainians to do. So I'm just worried, even if you think Trump really did want to turn, I think it was Obama who wants to explain the U.S. government as like a massive ocean freighter, right? Like this huge ship. If you decide you want to turn it around, you can't just turn it around. It takes large amounts of time and a lot of effort to actually make that turn. And so I don't see Trump having that ability or maybe even the desire.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. He would face opposition from virtually every single Republican in Congress if he decided to do something like that. I think he would probably have the power to cut certain things off that could really affect Israel's war machine, especially like the maintenance of its air force, of all the warplanes and everything that are American made. But yeah, he would really face a lot of opposition, and we did see it. Did this really happen? We did see that the reports that he did pause the military shipments to Ukraine. So I do think at one point before quickly resuming them, I think he would have the ability to at least briefly, cut off the weapons shipments and everything. But the question is he really going to do that? I haven't seen any indication that that's something he's seriously considering. But Netanyahu did say that the reason why he has to restart this aid is due to pressure from the U.S. Um, so again, Biden did put some kind of pressure on Israel as well to make sure that they let aid trucks in when he was in, but he wasn't putting any pressure at all really on them to reach a ceasefire. And that's become very clear. So that's the question. We're starting to see maybe some Biden like tactics from the Trump administration. All these reports about how Netanyahu and Trump are at odds. And now there's one saying that JD Vance canceled his trip to Israel because they didn't want to be seen as endorsing Israel's plans to escalate in Gaza. But as long as they're providing the bombs and everything, they are certainly doing more than just endorsing those plans.
Yeah. Well, I imagine one of the things going on here, Dave, is in a sense, one of the differences between Trump and, Hillary Clinton or a member of the foreign policy establishment, Blinken, Sullivan, is he is kind of a human being. I mean, he's a very rich human being, but when people show him pictures of children who are starving to death, I think that has an emotional impact on Trump. I don't think he would ever be like Madeleine Albright and say, we think the death of 500,000 children was worth it in Iraq. Like, I don't think Trump necessarily thinks that way. At the same time, he also thinks about things in these massive deals. And so let's play this clip of Donald Trump discussing the Israel issue while on his Middle East trip.
On Gaza, and Gaza has been a territory of death and destruction. The United States get involved and make it just a freedom zone, have a real freedom zone. Put people in homes where they can be safe, and Hamas is going to have to be dealt with. You got to remember, October 7th was one of the worst days in the history of the world, I think, not just local to this region. It was one of the worst, most atrocious attacks anyone's ever seen. But now we're dealing with Hamas, and we're dealing with Iran, and we're dealing with a lot of other things. We're dealing with the Houthis. And that was, I think, very successful. But maybe tomorrow an attack will be made, in which case we go back on the offensive. So it's good. It's good. We have a lot of things happening, a lot of very positive things happening. Okay? Thank you.
Dave, as positive as some of Trump's comments and maybe some of his instincts are when it comes to Israel, we see him say this. And of course, earlier in his administration, he was saying this was a part of a plan to expel all Palestinians from Gaza. And over the weekend, I wrote this story for antiwar.com. U.S. Embassy denies report of plan to send 1 million Palestinians to Libya. And I think the significance there is that NBC News initially reported that this was the case. So it was only a day or so later that the U.S. Embassy actually denied it. But the U.S. and Israel have reportedly been shopping a third country to take in the Palestinians for some time. So my question to you, Dave, is even if he doesn't want to see little children starve to death, is he still signed on to the genocide in in Gaza?
Well, I think a lot of people have downplayed what Trump said, his whole plan for the US to take over Gaza and saying, all the Palestinians have to go and they're going to go build them, beautiful houses somewhere else. But if you look at what Netanyahu is saying, what other Israeli officials are saying, just what Smotrich said today, he said, this is the plan. We're going to destroy Gaza and then we're going to move the Palestinians, to other countries in accordance with the Trump plan. So by Trump suggesting that and essentially signing off on the idea of the ethnic cleansing, that gave Netanyahu, I really think that motivated him and his government to, go ahead with this next big escalation and establish these plans to force all the Palestinians into one tiny area of Gaza before, with the idea of pressuring them to leave. But the thing standing in their way is where are they going to go? I mean, there has not been a serious, viable plan put forward. The Libya thing, I mean, seeing that in NBC News, it's like, I do think that that probably was a conversation at some level. I don't know if it was actually a conversation between the U.S. and Libya at any point, but within the Trump administration, it wouldn't surprise me if that's an idea that was floated, and it does seem so absurd. There's also been reports of them considering Somalia or Sudan. It's almost like the requirement is for the country to be like in the middle of a war for them to consider dumping the Palestinians there. But yeah, it seems like so. It's interesting. There was another report from NBC. This was one of the ones saying that Trump and Netanyahu were at odds with each other, and that said Trump was opposed to Israel's plans to escalate in Gaza because he thought it would get in the way of his plan for the U.S. to, take over and rebuild Gaza. So, and if you look at what Netanyahu's saying, he's operating, at least based on his conversations that he's having with like the Knesset, he's operating under the assumption that the U.S. is going to take over Gaza. Which, I mean, again, as crazy as that sounds, as easy it was to kind of laugh off what Trump said, this is really, playing a big factor here in Israel's plans.
The reason they're approaching countries like Somalia, Sudan, Puntland, Somaliland, Libya is because, I mean, who's going to be desperate enough to take on, right? If this is what helps the Sudanese military junta finally defeat the RSF, maybe eventually they say yes to it. Maybe this, as the Libyan government in Tripoli is apparently under fire, right? The forces of Khalifa Haftar are fighting near the city center at this point. Uh, what they get desperate at for U.S. help, and suddenly they're getting military aid, some drone strikes, things like that to turn the tide. For Somaliland or Puntland, international recognition from the United States would be a massive gift. And we saw during the Biden administration the way we bribed Kenya into becoming our proxy force in Haiti to fight a war against the gangs there. We said, "Oh, you're now a non-NATO ally." So there's so many things that we could offer these countries. And of course, if we're doing it with these countries and then even with Syria, which Trump seems to be awfully friendly with Jolani, who is apparently a attractive young man. So I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this hasn't been like spelled out really, but I'm assuming that like the idea is, like you said, like a country like Libya or Somaliland to say, okay, we'll unlock, lift whatever sanctions there might be on you, give you access to all these funds, maybe help build up your military, and then I'm guessing the idea would be then like Qatar or the UAE would fund like building housing and building like a camp for 1 million Palestinians to go to in the desert. Yeah, I'm just kind of, I feel like that's probably what Trump is thinking. I mean, I think his whole idea is like, look at all the money that the Saudis and the UAE has. They could fund, pay for this new beautiful housing for the Palestinians, but it can't be in Gaza. Like that seems to be his thinking. And so, I mean, you see what Syria is willing to do right now with Jelani. It seems to be willing to crack down on the Palestinian resistance groups in Syria and normalize with Israel to get that sanctions relief from the U.S. So yeah, the U.S. certainly has a powerful way to bribe these countries here to get them to do something like this.
I want to move on and ask you a few questions about the U.S. talks with Iran and if we're moving towards a deal or not. But first, want to ask the audience to share the show, whether you're watching live now on YouTube or ads. That would be a huge favor to us. We are also live on Facebook and Rumble if you would like to share the show and watch live there. So, Dave, have to ask you here about the Iran talks. There was this report over the weekend. Trump sends nuclear proposal to Tehran and demands Iran act quickly. And then I think you have the update here, which is Witkoff says U.S. cannot allow any Iran nuclear enrichment. And so, Dave, what's going on here actually is Trump's policy when it comes to Iran, and what is he demanding the Iranians do to, I guess, get brought back into the.
Yeah, so for a while there, I mean, it wasn't really clear if the US was actually demanding the zero enrichment in the negotiations. But by what Witkoff says here, it does sound like that has been the US demand. Although it's hard to believe because negotiations have been moving along. So, but Witkoff is saying that, I was pretty surprised by this for him to publicly say, that any enrichment of uranium is a red line. Like the U.S. will never accept any kind of deal where Iran's civilian enrichment program remains intact. But of course, for Iran, that's a huge red line. They've made it very clear that it's non-negotiable. And that was Iran's response, essentially saying that our enrichment program will continue whether there's a deal or not. And this is the demand that we're seeing. It was actually every single Republican in the Senate, except for Rand Paul, and a bunch of House representatives, I believe 177 Republicans from the House, sent a letter to Trump saying, basically demanding that any deal must eliminate the enrichment. And it's, what they're trying to sabotage the diplomacy because it's just Iran's not going to agree to that. So where do we stand now in negotiations? I mean, it's really not clear. Again, it's hard to believe that these things were moving along if that's what the U.S. was demanding. And, Trump has made similar comments, but he's also said that essentially that he's open to the idea of enrichment, of them maintaining some kind of civilian enrichment program. But to see Witkoff say that publicly is just a really bad sign, I think, for the chances of a deal here.
I'm the opinion editor at antiwar.com, read quite a few op-eds a day, and I think one of the best analysts when it comes to U.S. and Iran policy is Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute, and he has this new article out. Witkoff's latest zero enrichment red line has zero chance of working, and in that article he explains this demand has, for 25 years, proven to both be futile and counterproductive. It gives Iran more time to advance its nuclear program while stalling the realistic verification-based deals that could actually constrain it. Unless Trump reverts to his original red line, weaponization, this is a rare chance to stop both the Iranian bomb and a war that could slip away. Witkoff's maximalist posture may be a bargaining tactic, but airing it publicly risks poisoning the atmosphere. As soon as Iran starts reciprocating, optimism could curdle into confrontation, slamming shut Trump's narrow window for diplomacy. And so I'm wondering what you think of Trita's remarks here. Do you think he's on the spot that making this demand could really push us in the wrong direction quickly?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And again, I think that's the purpose of, we see Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, they came out and gave this big press conference saying that, any deal must eliminate the enrichment program. And they also say like Iran's got to, it's also got to cover their ballistic missiles program and their support for their allies in the region. And these are just demands that, again, just aren't realistic and I think are designed to kill the chances of diplomacy. Now, the one thing that I think is interesting that's being floated around, there was a bunch of reports about this, and now an Iranian official said they could be open to this, is this idea of like a consortium, a nuclear enrichment consortium between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE that would be based in Iran, like an enrichment program that would involve the Saudis. I think it's kind of a smart proposal. The Iranians deny that it was their idea, but I don't know where else it would have come from, because we know that the Trump administration, they're seeking this deal. I mean, the idea of the deal is to give the Saudis a civilian nuclear program in exchange for Israeli normalization, but there's no normalization going to happen soon. But I don't know. I think that's kind of an interesting proposal because it would put the enrichment program, not only under Iran's control, but also the Saudis. And apparently the UAE, this is the idea, and it would give it, kind of maybe extra safeguards or something like that. So maybe that's a workable thing, but these demands from Witkoff, I really think are are bad to see.
I do agree with you, Dave. My only glimmer of hope here is that maybe this is the smartest political tactic Trump could come up with. He understands that if he publicly states that nuclear enrichment is something that he's going to allow Iran to do, the Hogs in the U.S. Senate are going to start passing bills saying that we can't make a deal or repeal the Iranian sanctions without the nuclear enrichment being gone. And so Trump is kind of sandbagging here in order to prevent the Republicans from having a massive lead up into talks. That's really the only way I could see this being a workable policy because, as some analysts, including Ted Snyder at antiwar.com, have argued, the Iranians engaging in talks. And so the Trump administration is privately telling Iran that they can't have nuclear enrichment. It seems unlikely that the Iranians would keep engaging in talks with the Americans. So, I just find this to be a kind of an interesting thing going on here, and I'm not sure where the truth lies. Now, Dave, want to move on and ask you about the Ukraine talks. Yesterday, Trump had a True Social post that must have been very important because the entire post was in all caps. He says, "I will be speaking by telephone to President Putin on Monday," which I guess that call should have happened by now. And Dave, so what do we know? What's the latest here?
Call did happen, and Trump posted about it on Truth Social again, saying that negotiations between Russia and Ukraine on a ceasefire will begin immediately. He said that he spoke with Zelensky and several European leaders afterward to inform them of this, that these negotiations would start. Um, it's a little strange because this happens a few days after Russia and Ukraine held their first direct talks in 3 years in Istanbul, but it didn't look like there was really any progress there on a ceasefire. But we did see from Putin, he also said that they're going to start working on what he called a memorandum on a potential peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine to hammer out the details of that. So it does seem like Putin's willing to, really negotiate here. Um, as of the time we're recording this, I haven't seen Zelensky's response yet. I'm not sure if he's put out a public statement about this. So it's hard to know, but Trump's latest post was he was really emphasizing this idea that negotiations would start immediately. So maybe there's some negotiations still in Istanbul. He also mentioned Pope Leo the 14th, his offer for the Vatican to host the talks. And Trump did mention that in his post. So maybe that's a potential venue for the negotiations. Maybe a kind of a change of scenery would be good for the two sides. So we'll see if this turns into something. But I've been pretty pessimistic about the chances of a deal here between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, there's not much hope, seeming to happen here, Dave, on that front. Now, one really great article that you wrote yesterday, and Dave, I mean, you do almost more coverage of the U.S. drone war on Somalia than any other journalist in the U.S. I mean, you document almost every U.S. drone strike there, and that is really important that somebody is doing that work. And I know, unfortunately, you yourself can't go to Somalia and actually examine the results of these airstrikes, but uh, at the same time, reporting every time the Pentagon does a press write up on this. And because you do that, you notice something interesting. They stopped saying if they were killing anybody in these strikes. And now I'm sure what the AFRICOM says, right? That's US Africa command says every time, oh, we killed 3 members of ISIS, we killed 4 members of Al-Shabaab, no civilians hurt, no civilians injured. Every time an actual journalist goes to Somalia and talks to the people about, the family members of who was killed, it's an elderly man, a little boy, it's 3 women walking alone somewhere or something like this, right? Just clearly not members of these militant groups, they say, but they stopped reporting it altogether. So you reached out to the Pentagon, and tell my audience what happened.
Yeah. So like you said, I noticed that these press releases changed. And as you mentioned, AFRICOM was not very transparent as it was. They would say, we killed X amount of militants and there's no civilian harm. And that's that. And then, there would never be any follow-up. And the issue with Somalia is that there's no real media coverage of these airstrikes, like virtually none. And basically, all I have to work with here is press releases from AFRICOM. So when I noticed that they got a lot shorter, I asked them about it. And the interesting thing here, so essentially what they said was that, while the new Trump administration settles in, we're not going to offer battle damage assessments or assessments on
Oh man.
bombing campaign in Yemen. They shared zero details about particular strikes, and they launched over 1,000 strikes according to the U.S. military. So yeah, I mean, they're essentially saying we're just not going to release any info on that, and this is that, and that's that. They said there's going to be some new guidance soon. Well, they'll start releasing things, but it doesn't really make sense because up until pretty recently, they were offering at least some assessment. The last press release where they did that was April 12th. So this isn't that long ago. And to frame it as as the administration settles in, it's like it's been over 100 days. I think you guys are pretty settled in. So I think it's just a matter of them. They just don't share the information, and they don't want to, or maybe they just don't even want to do the assessments. I mean, the same thing again with Yemen. I mean, there was no real assessments. The comments that we saw from U.S. Central Command, I remember at one time they said, "Oh, we've killed X amount of Houthi fighters according to open source reports." And open source just means what you could find on the internet. So, they didn't really know, from sources on the ground, who they were killing, how many people they were killing. It was very clear they were killing a lot of civilians. So I think it might be a similar thing. They're just kind of launching these airstrikes and not really, taking the word of the government that they back there on who they're attacking. I mean, in one case recently, the U.S. bombed a boat in Somalia. Actually, bombed two boats, claiming that they were smuggling weapons. I mean, how can you really know that without boarding the boat? And how can you know that the crew is even aware? Say they are smuggling weapons, is even aware exactly of what they're carrying? I mean, depending on what kind of boat it was. So,
Yeah.
it's just a thing that, as you said, it just gets zero attention. So, I've been trying to find any kind of reports on the ground because we see reports from some Somali media. A lot of it is very pro-government, because it probably comes from whatever aid they get from the U.S. that funds some of these media outlets. But about kind of the fighting on the ground and some airstrikes, and but just nothing about exactly what the U.S. is doing here.
It's amateur hour over at the Pentagon. At one point, job site news that's Jeremy Scahill, Ryan Grimm, and others reported that a lot of the intelligence they were using for the U.S. airstrikes in Yemen was either old Saudi intelligence or intelligence that came from the Israelis. And so the Americans really weren't even waging their own war here. They were just, bombing the targets that Israel told them to. And you have to imagine if that's the case in Yemen, then in Somalia, they're probably going off the intelligence from the Mogadishu based government, which seems like, another one of these governments in Africa that's increasingly desperate, where there are attacks going on closer and closer to Mogadishu. Al Shabaab is taking more territory. And so they may be getting fairly reckless in where they're calling in airstrikes. Now, Dave, just before we wrap up here, my last question is, and talking about Somalia and focusing there, just what has Trump's policy been towards Somalia? I think a lot of people kind of remember from his first administration when it just referred to the fact that Trump tried to remove all U.S. troops from Somalia at the beginning and the end of his administration. But I think there were a lot of bombs dropped on that country in between those times.
Yeah, in his first administration, he really ramped up the air campaign in Somalia. And he sent regular troops there for the first time in I believe a few decades. And then it was at the end of his administration that he pulled those troops out. Special operations forces remained, and the U.S. basically conducts airstrikes could conduct the airstrikes from Djibouti anyway. But yeah, he really did escalate it, and something that went very unnoticed throughout his first term. And then Biden came in, and he redeployed the troops. He continued the air campaign, not to the level that Trump did. And then now we're seeing the same thing, an escalation of this air campaign. By my count, just based on AFRICOM press releases, the U.S. has launched at least 24 airstrikes in Somalia since Trump came into office, which is a lot for Somalia. Last year, in all of 2024, the U.S. launched 9 strikes. And again, this is based on the AFRICOM releases. The CIA is also known to conduct drone strikes in Somalia, and they don't, publicize them. Um, and there were some indications on the Biden administration that there were other U.S. airstrikes happening that weren't being reported. So this is following the pattern from the first administration with Somalia. And there's also, recently, because the government is under threat from this al-Shabaab offensive, and apparently Mogadishu, there's a chance that Mogadishu could fall to al-Shabaab. There was a debate within the Trump administration. State Department officials said, let's close the embassy and evacuate. I mean, that's apparently how bad the threat is. But there's other officials, and leading the charge is Sebastian Gorka, who is, a media personality. A lot of people are probably familiar with him, but he's the head of counterterrorism on the National Security Council. And he wants the U.S. to double down and escalate in Somalia and just double down on this failed policy, propping up this government that has less and less power and support every year. I mean, even more regions of Somalia have withdrawn from the federal government system. So they really don't control much territory. And there's reports too of soldiers not fighting, refusing to fight al-Shabaab. It's not looking good for them. So they could get increasingly desperate.
I remember I once read an article about Somalia, and it was just, a story about something that happened there. But they were talking about generals from the Somali National Army, the one the U.S. helped to build, the Mogadishu-based government's army, and multiple generals were former members of al-Shabaab who had taken their fighters and joined up the military, and that's how they stopped fighting against the Mogadishu-based government. And so that certainly seems like conditions ripe for once things really start going wrong, and especially if the American money stops flowing or something like that, they can't get their funds. Things could turn around very quickly in Somalia for the U.S. nation building project there. Well, Dave DeCamp, thank you so much. Everybody, check out Dave's work every day, news.antiwar.com, and his Twitter at DeCampDave, and his great show, Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp. Dave, did I miss anything?
No, I think that's it. I think that covers it.
All right, Dave, I always appreciate your time on the show. Everybody, be sure to subscribe and share to the Kyle Anzalone Show. We are live on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Rumble every Monday and Wednesday at 4:45 Eastern. Also, if you subscribe to us on YouTube, it will help us out with the algorithm, but also you could leave a comment and let us know other guests you'd like to have on a show, other topics you want me to talk about. There's so much that could cover, so many great people to talk to. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be back with another show soon.